Okay, good evening and a warm welcome to Wigtown Book Festival. Take your seats, as it were, get comfortable, and we will begin. My name is Gemma Neville. I'm a writer and an activist, and I'm joining you tonight from home near Edinburgh. So, as you know, tonight's event is all about Cal Flyn's new book, Islands of Abandonment. You see it there? And we're going to, glad Cal's got her copy too. So we'll get stuck into that shortly. But before I introduce Cal and the book, I'll just go over a bit about the format for tonight. You might see my eyes darting around a little bit just as I keep an eye on the chat. We already have questions coming in, lots of interest in this book. As I look to the book as well. So I'm going to be in conversation with Cal and we'll hear a reading from the book. And then I want to bring in all of you into the discussion. So do get your questions and your comments ready. You can post your questions, your comments in the chat box. It's either as the YouTube link or Facebook comments if you're joining that way. The event is sponsored by Baillie Gifford. It's free tickets, so if you can, please do buy the book direct from Wigtown's own online bookshop. Good. Well, hopefully you found a pew and you're in the virtual tent now at the festival. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our author this evening, Cal Flyn. Cal is a writer and a journalist based in the Highlands. She's in Stromness this evening. How lovely. And Cal's first book, Thicker Than Water, was a Times Book of the Year. She has been made a MacDowell Fellow in 2019, and she's a columnist for Prospect magazine. Islands of Abandonment, Life in the Post-Human Landscape, which we're discussing tonight, came out in January of this year, and it's a multi-layered study into what happens to places left behind after nuclear disaster, volcanic eruption, war, migration, economic decline. We get it all in this book. So it's about the spaces in between, the times in between, and in some chapters too, the people in between. There's lots of hard scientific data in the book. It's meticulously researched. So lots of data about ecology and geography, but having been immersed in it the last few days, I can reassure you, if you've not read it yet, it's also very human with interviews and memoir extracts. And as many of us do emerge out of lockdown, these themes of abandonment, absence, yearning, well, they're very current, aren't they? Very real. Let's get started with a short reading, please, from Cal to set the mood. So Cal, welcome. Over to you, please.
Thanks so much, Gemma. An absolute pleasure to be here this evening. Wigtown's absolutely my favourite literary festival, so I'm really pleased to be here to chat. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm going to do a short reading. I think when I talk to people about this book, quite often the example that I go to explain the concept of what this book is about is the Chernobyl exclusion zone. This was the first location that I went to when I was writing this book. And I think it's just a very clear and sort of immediately recognizable example of what I mean when I talk about environments where people have left and nature has returned. So I'm going to read a little bit from that section in the book because I think it gives you a good sense of the subject, but also the mood and the tone of the book more generally. I step outside, descend a set of steps, and as I do, from nowhere the dosimeter in my pocket raises its voice from the occasional background click to the crackle of white noise before overloading and sounding its warning alarm, a two-note siren of a timbre and pitch that seems intended to fluster. A jolt of adrenaline hits my system. What's happening? I blurt out, embarrassingly panicked but unable to contain myself. The silence, The inodorousness, the invisibility of the danger preys on my mind. I'm blindfolded in a room of poisoned daggers. What's happening? Ludmilla waves my panic away. Hotspot, she says, and my fear evaporates with the label in the way a grave medical diagnosis might sometimes bring relief. She points to the bottom step. Liquidators returning from the reactor area kick the dirt from their boots and remove their clothes here before getting into minibuses that parked out front. These minibuses, too contaminated to save, would later be buried in vast mass graves lined with concrete. The dust they left behind has left a radioactive trace which persists into the present. I hold my dosimeter over what seems to be the hotspot's epicenter, a concrete slab shrouded in leaf mold, and watch the numbers climbing. It stops at 15.82 microsieverts an hour, around 100 times the background dose. Ludmilla thrusts her hand out over mine, and the dosimeter in her grip is bigger, more professional looking. Its reading is different, higher. It likes cesium, she shrugs, and though I don't understand, I feel myself jealous. Can I hold it, I ask. I take the wailing device, and when I step away, it falls silent, and I relax. The sky is white cloud, too bright to look at. The air is still. I follow the steps down to the cafe's private jetty, from which I look out across a smooth curve of ice that lids the lake's surface, one that does not break when I drop a rock onto it. And what I think about is this, how the past is imprinted upon the present in every place, but never more tangibly than here. I navigate it blindly in the present, with a dosimeter as a torch. The zone is full of hotspots, and sometimes they've been marked by a small yellow lollipop signpost whose triangular face wears a nuclear trefoil, the international symbol for ionizing radiation in red. These signs are planted throughout the zone, marking places to avoid. They're not dangerous, exactly, but you shouldn't stand there long. At the city limits, we pass another on the side of the road. Can we stop? I say, and the driver shrugs. I get out and cross to the verge by the sign and keep stepping until I hear the warble of the dosimeter. All I see is a field of thick, tussocky grass, poking through a thin layer of snow, ungrazed, unmown. Pine seedlings are bristling on the edges of the clearing amid a shimmer of birch, thin upper limbs of russet and wine over silvered, glimmering torsos. A thin white mist hangs about a foot over the ground, ethereal, waiting to be parted, and it has started to snow. Heavy flakes fall in slow motion onto my hair and my crown. I shut my eyes, feeling cold fingers touching my face, and visualize radiation washing over me, bathing me in a current of which I'm only abstractly aware, whose existence is a matter of faith. It's one thing to understand this concept in a lecture, I think. Another altogether to comprehend your body at the mercy of it. It takes a certain mystical frame of mind, one I'm not unfamiliar with. I surrender myself to it, to its greater power. I feel my boundaries blur, grow indistinct. Gamma rays pass me on their way elsewhere. After a minute or so, I step away and hear the sirens fall to a crackle. I feel nothing. I think, I am not afraid.
Thank you. It's beautifully read, and I think really sets the tone for the book. If you're just joining us, we're here tonight discussing Islands of Abandonment, Cal Flyn's new book. And you know, that chapter set at Chernobyl in Ukraine, I suppose it's a good example for me as the reader of a place very shaped by an event that's within living memory for many of us. And somewhere where all is not as first seems as you tread gently. You cross continents and travel far in the book, from Ukraine to Tanzania, Cyprus, Rust Belt's United States, and the home in the Orkney Islands, which was frankly a treat for those of us who haven't left home in a very long time to vicariously spin the globe with you. So can you begin just tell me a bit about the inspiration and logistical planning for this book?
Yes, absolutely. So the book covers 13 different locations, 12 of which are sort of the main locations, and the book actually opens on Inverleith, which is an island in the Firth of Forth. Inchkeith, not Inverleith. So I guess that's partly where I began. I was living in Edinburgh when I first started working on this book, and this abandoned island I could practically see from my house. When I looked out, I could see these small islands sitting in the Firth of Forth, which had been fortified during the Second World War and have now become sort of home to many different types of breeding birds, especially seabirds, migrant birds, and also there are now valuable seal colonies, especially in winter when they are in their pupping season. And I think that this was kind of a useful metaphor for thinking about the withdrawal of humans more generally, and the sort of handing over of certain environments, however unpurposeful, back to nature, and kind of the value that these habitats can go on to gain and regain. So another place that didn't make it into the book, but I really enjoyed visiting and sort of started me thinking along these lines, were the Slate Islands, which are just off Argyll. So these are islands that were the epicenter really of the slate industry in the 19th century. And when I went to visit, you find these huge, deep quarries, which have now been flooded with seawater, and it's really an amazing landscape. You know, if you're into wild swimming like I am, you can go down and swim in a series of quarries with this amazing sort of turquoise water. It's just like a paint palette. And I think what those places made me think about was this kind of different kind of beauty, and one that I hadn't really been prepared to find in a post-industrial environment. So I found it sort of aesthetically really beautiful, and that made me also start thinking, I guess, more in terms of other types of value that these landscapes can have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and Easdale and the Slate Islands are beautiful places, but you wouldn't catch me swimming there. Far too spooky. Glad to hear from your side. I like that each chapter works kind of as a standalone piece, actually, although there's a clear narrative arc. And I also like that you reject the linear, sometimes overly simplistic tendency to see nature as purely healing or wild places to be discovered. I guess there is a delicate balance, between romanticizing decay in nature and where you place yourself in the story. Do you think that nature writing as a genre, which is having a moment just now, do you think it's changing, and to what extent is gender relevant in how you're placing yourself in the story?
Oh, that's such an interesting question. I think definitely nature writing is changing. I think for some of those reasons that you just named there, I mean, this sort of tendency to over-romanticize, I think at some stage sort of reached a peak, and there's been a lot of kickback against that. And certainly, I don't know, I think I've had that sort of in the back of my mind all the way through working on this book, is this like interplay with sort of romanticism, which I don't know, I think I am sort of unapologetically a romantic in some senses, but also with I don't know, a sense of realism, or a sense of even environmental pessimism, which I think is more and more suffusing the public mood. And what I didn't want to do when I was writing this book was sort of come in Pollyannish, saying, everything's going to be fine. And it's not as simple as you say, as sort of you hand things back to nature and everything's okay. Saying that, I do think that it's important for us to remain hopeful and to find beauty where there is beauty, and to think critically and hopefully about where this planet's going. And so when I'm writing a type of nature writing, it is in some sense sort of putting lyricism or beauty into these anthropogenic environments, as I guess that you should sort of technically call them, but also, tone that with, this sense of, I don't know, melancholy or regret, so that we have the sense of these being sort of deeply impacted, often contaminated landscape. And yes, there is somewhere for them to go. And also it's on such a huge stage. I mean, I do talk about this in the book, about how forest regrowth is now on an enormous scale, and actually so enormous, the forest regrowth on abandoned farmland, that really you have to calculate it into climatology models. And abandoned land is really on an enormous scale, and it almost by definition goes unstudied and unappreciated. We just let our eyes like slip over it as we pass it. So I think it was, to me, a way of retuning my eyes to the world that was around me, and focusing in on stuff that I pass every day but didn't really think about. And also that sort of sense of trying to find hope and a way to go on, as anyone who's sort of interested in the environment has to do. About gender and nature writing, I'm not sure, actually. I think I have quite a simplistic approach to that. I am a woman and I do write this, and those are the facts that I've got. I think the most pressing thing about being a woman and writing a book like this was going places alone, which is just something that you have to think a lot more about when you're a woman. But I also don't think that it necessarily has held me back, and there are more and more, I think, female nature writers around. There was just an anthology published a couple of days ago called Women on Nature by Catherine Norbury, or edited by Catherine Norbury, and just like an amazing compendium of female writers about nature and the environment, brought together in one book, both historic and also present. So it's definitely, like a very rich vein of literature that continues to produce great books today.
And I was going to come to this later, but as you brought it up on hope, I liked a reference you make to Rebecca Solnit, another the female flaneuse. She talks about the blue of distance, and you then pick up the green of time. You say the green of time, the green that grows from nothing. Anything is left. If anything is left for long enough, I'm paraphrasing. Leaf green, lime green, the green of fresh new shoots. So that was a very searing colour palette for me in the book, and it's infused with hope, not in a naive way, I think, because we are confronted with the realities of the climate emergency, but there is this message about nature being redemptive. With enough time, the regreening process does occur. Are you a hopeful person, or did the experience of the research make you so?
I think I am a hopeful person, or it depends on your mood. On your mood, and I think that's very much, especially when I was coming to write the final chapter, which touches a lot on climate change and where we might be in sort of 100 years or 1,000 or 10,000 years. I found myself swinging really from emotional extremes. So some days when you think about climate change, you think it's impossible, and we're facing an impossible situation, and maybe it's too late to do anything. And then the next day, I would be writing about forest regrowth and the extent of carbon capture on land that has not even been done by people. It's just happening all by itself, and you start feeling this sort of surge of hope that maybe actually all is not lost. And then you see how adaptive animals or plants are, as so many of the examples in my books prove. And I start feeling like maybe actually it might not all be lost. And I think that it's not so much that I'm necessarily a sort of genetically hopeful person, as I feel the hope some days, and then I've sort of come to rationally argue that being hopeful and thinking hopefully is actually a more useful way to be. So I guess it comes from two places.
Good. And I suppose it's human nature to want to collect, and there's a chapter set in Tanzania which looks at the after effects of some messing with nature by some overzealous botanists. Maybe this is cheeky of me to ask, but were you ever tempted to take anything as a souvenir from these derelict buildings or wastelands, which would be human nature? I wondered if you did, or were the memories and photographs enough?
I think memories and photographs were generally enough for me. I always find, it's a bit like when you go to a beach and you start looking for like really nice shaped stones, and when you get home, they're never quite as nice as you remember them being, or they're not as nice when they're not wet. So I think I definitely had that sense of wanting to sort of go and return, what's it they say, without a trace, leave no trace. So I think I had that sort of in my mind, especially because in abandoned places, you often find that in the most popular abandoned places, other people have been there before you, especially kind of the really photogenic ones. And often people can sort of fiddle around with objects to make them somehow better to photograph, and then that gives the whole place a very strange, inauthentic feel. So I'm kind of against that, and my sense of trying to move lightly through places. But I do have I think it's a 1970 copy of the Reader's Digest, which I ended up reading to pass the time when I couldn't sleep in the attic room of an abandoned house on the island of Swona. The only book I'd taken with me was a copy of Jeff Vandermeer's Annihilation, which I do not recommend that you read when alone on an island overnight and you can't sleep. It is just horrifying and exactly the wrong kind of book to have with you. So the only thing I could find that was not sort of frightening environmental horror was this Reader's Digest. So I took that home as a souvenir. I don't think that was...
Anyone who's read that chapter will forgive you. Like a very terrifying and sleep depriving experience, although really good to get a flavour of something so close to home, because that's set in Orkney, so you're forgiven. Freedom to err, as it was, is allowed. And I want to now turn to wild being a relative term as well, the near and the far of wildness. And I'm asking for forgiveness of those who have erred in their own smaller or greater ways. You'll be aware of current movement in Scotland, and here we are at Scottish Book Festival, movements to rewild large parts of Highland Scotland, like the Glenfeshie estate and the Isle of Rum as well, possibly having the reintroduction of apex predators, wolves, lynx, bear. And that sounds quite exciting for those of us who play in the city. So yeah, I mean, does that seem like responsible repair to you, or has the experience of this book taught you that the best intervention is just let nature get on with it?
Yeah, actually, I think it's interesting because certainly the locations that I talk about in Islands of Abandonment are, in many senses of the word, rewilded of their own accord. But what people talk about when they talk about rewilding is often this quite hands-on approach. And that's not to say that it's wrong exactly, it's just that it's very different. I think one thing I find interesting about rewilding as a movement is that those who are sort of in charge of rewilding do have aims, I suppose, and objectives and plans for the land. And often rewilding takes the form of well, as you mentioned, sort of reintroductions of species or planting trees, or and all of these things are quite sort of hands-on. And I think that way of thinking, it's not so much that I disagree with it completely, but it's just that I do want people to remember that this is still the hand of man acting upon the land. And I do worry that it's almost a colonial way of thinking, this we know the right thing for the land and we're going to make it happen, and if it doesn't happen the way that we plan, I don't think that that's necessarily exactly how all of these rewilding projects work. I think it's just that sort of something to bear in mind when planning for things like that. Is not that I'm against the reintroduction of wolves, but I find that very interesting. But at the same time, it's our sort of vision of what the land might look like with wolves. That's now becomes another sort of artificial thing that's happening. So I guess more and more as I sort of get into writing about abandonment, the more I became sort of interested in this sort of idea of sort of pure nature or pure rewilding, and that's the phenomena that I'm particularly interested in.
Yeah, it's complex and messy, and all the more interesting because of it, isn't it? And that's interesting. You mentioned the colonialism because your first book was Thicker Than Water. Is set in Australia, post-colonial Australia, and yeah, I was wondering if sort of themes around preserving, collecting nature controlling nature is bound up with national identity, which is, problematic at times.
Definitely. Yeah, I think I didn't expect to find parallels, but they jumped out at me. I think it was that sort of sense that of knowing best, or that kind of thing. I think what now makes me very interested in ecology and conservation is the fact that it's not always clear what the best route forward is. And so it's very easy to sort of give money towards the environment, but there are all these different, competing philosophies for what the best thing to do is, and what the sort of the nicest thing to do for nature is. Is it, that we plant all of these trees and we bring back apex predators? Is it that we just leave to its own devices? There's no obvious route forward that is, inarguably good. And that's where my interest, I guess, focuses really in on, like when everyone thinks that they want to do the right thing, what is the right thing? I don't know. I always become very sort of focused in on ethical questions, and then I find it impossible to entirely answer them myself, But yeah, I think that at the moment this is a huge question in how we go ahead in conservation and in ecology more generally.
Yeah. Oh, you walk a gentle path on loaded territory here about the land management and balancing people in place. And I think sort of credit's due for the thorough research you've done it, and bringing in references to experts in the field. So that I hope that you've had a fair reception from conservationists, academics alike. Now I'm going to come to audience questions shortly, so you're on notice, please, Wigtown guests. I've got a few more of my own, but our first question actually has come in from Timothy. Is sort of continuing on a little bit from what we're just chatting about. So let's bring Timothy in. He says, to what extent do you think that your interest and attraction to abandoned places has arisen from your background as a Highlander, given the Highlands were notably depopulated in the 18th, 19th centuries?
Yeah, that's a really great question, because it's also one that I've been thinking about quite a lot in a couple of different ways. So in my first book, Thicker Than Water, I wrote quite a bit about the Highland clearances as backdrop to colonialism in Australia, because I followed a sort of distant relative from clearance era Scotland to Australia, and that was kind of how he got caught up with violence on the frontier there. I am very interested in the clearances, and of course, growing up in the Highlands, it is, is ever present, I think. And one thing that I'm interested in and sort of fascinates me is how the absence of people in the Highlands is both terribly melancholy and a sort of bleak and dark part of history that colours everything that happens there. But it's also one of our strange and paradoxical strengths. This is where much of the beauty comes from in the landscape, and also where much of the sort of the wilder aspects of nature, why they've been allowed to remain. But this question of wilderness and the absence of people has really become to be quite contested recently, especially, as with more sort of landowners coming in to buy up land to rewild them, and there being friction sometimes with local people who don't see this place as being a wilderness. I think that is a big question that we in Scotland are going to be, a big debate that we're going to be having for decades to come. So I think definitely my interest has definitely come from that sort of Highland background. And also, when it comes to islands of abandonment in particular, I think it's always something I have in the back of my mind. So some people have said, is the answer we turf off people and we create more exclusion zones? And then because I have this background knowledge of that, the clearances and the impact that can have on our entire people, I know that I would never argue for that. It's more, I've become more interested in where that happens almost organically or naturally. If this is marginal farmland that people are moving off as it becomes urbanized, then that seems a win-win, because people are choosing to leave for separate reasons, and then we also have this sort of land that starts to be empty and goes spared, and that sort of has its own sadness, because there are sort of rural communities that are dissolving, but environmentally it's again, and so there's always this give and take between populations, I think, and the human presence and then the positives of absence of human presence. And I think, I don't know, you have to appreciate both of those things.
You have a great expression in the book, ecological memory foam, and it's a literary work. It's lyrical in its textual richness, your writing. But I found it curious that so much nature vocabulary is borrowed to describe, economic phenomena. So you talk about growth, blight, decay. When you're spending time with residents in Patterson, New Jersey, and Detroit, Michigan. And actually, we have a question / comment here in the chat from Willie, who's saying, by definition, would there'd be nobody around in abandoned places to get much first-hand testimony? Did you find a way around that in your research? So I know from reading that some of these abandoned places are home for people left behind, or who have chosen for their own reasons to make it home. So your comments on that would be good to hear. I was going to ask you, are the people or the place the protagonist for you? In terms of your way in to a place as a temporal visitor. And perhaps Willie's also hinting at, how was the reception from the people that you met in these so-called abandoned places? Was it, did they like that description? If you,
yeah, sure. Because as you touched on there, the one thing that really shocked me, I think, as I really got my research underway, was that very few abandoned places turn out to be completely empty. Even in the exclusion zones that I went to, I found people sort of had to sneak back in and were living there, or often there are urban explorers who have been to these places if they're smaller. What you do find in these places are smaller numbers of people, and often people that either they've got nowhere else to go, as with in Patterson, New Jersey, I spoke to homeless people who had made this place their home because they had no other form of accommodation. Or in Chernobyl, sorry, I mentioned this a second ago, but I met a farmer who had come back with his wife only a year after the nuclear incident, and he'd sneaked back in with his whole family, and they'd set up their lives there. So I did tend to find people in almost all the places, and then it becomes a whole section on its own, sort of why people choose to hang out in abandoned places, and what impact it has on them. And I see it as being sort of a two-ended process. So there's an attraction and a repulsion, and so many of us find the atmosphere of abandoned places very creepy, very frightening. One feels at risk, often scared. So there's that thing that sort of saps our energy, and certainly abandoned places within an urban environment have a very negative impact on public health, local mental health. There tends to be a rise in crime. So there's all this sort of negative impact on brownfield sites and abandoned places more generally. But there's also this sort of attraction, which is people feel drawn towards abandoned places because they feel that by entering them, they somehow step outside the normal bounds of society. And so, I met a guy in Patterson who likes to go hang out in these burnt out old factories and meet people, and he would smoke drugs, and generally he felt free and sort of outside of the normal constraints that he felt held him down in his normal life. Or Wheeler, who was a local urban explorer, he would go there just, I think, because he liked that sense of freedom, and he had gotten into urban exploring from a very young age, I think, as a kind of disaffected youth, and he would go places to like break windows and all sorts of things. I think you find like a lot of teenagers, especially teenage boys, find themselves attracted to these places. So there were more people than I expected to find, but certainly when it comes to research on abandoned places, that can be tricky, especially on getting a sense of how much abandoned land there is around the world. There have been quite a few attempts to estimate the total amount of abandoned land, especially when it comes to forest cover. And that's very difficult, I think, because from above it's hard to define, and on the ground often there are no, records of exactly when a place fell into dereliction. So that can be tricky.
Do not enter signs being a hint that you maybe not meant to be warmly welcomed. Was abandoned places always the title in your mind for this work, or did that come later?
I think Islands of Abandonment came very early, actually. I don't know that when I was trying to explain to my agent what I was thinking of, it just sort of jumped to mind. And so I think that it was in the first 5 sentences I ever wrote that was about this book, just as a very weird and sketchy idea of what it might mean. And the phrase, I don't know, I found it, I guess, evocative at the beginning, and later the more I learned about the phenomenon I was interested in, the more I felt it really fitted exactly what it was. Because the way I think about it is that it's not necessarily literal islands, although a few of the sites that I go to are, but that they are metaphorical islands, or it's useful from an ecological perspective to think of them as islands, because they're sort of islands of wildness in a sea of tarmac and brick, or in an otherwise intensively developed agricultural area. So actually, in fact, the phrase came from a woman called Barbara Harvey, who studied the Bings in West Lothian, which I also write about, because they have become sort of unexpectedly these sort of amazing, quote unquote islands, or island refugia for wildlife, which is what this local ecologist came up with as a phrase, and this concept of islands really stuck. So that's it came in early.
There's borders and boundaries to negotiate throughout, whether it's the danger of landmines, or whether it's a ferry crossing of a literal island. So yeah, I think it definitely works. Okay, let me see if there's any more questions coming in, and please keep them coming, and I'll be alert to seeing things. If not, there's more for me, which is great. It might be nice, Cal, if you gave us a short reading from the Patterson, New Jersey chapter, which I knew you had in mind, because you were talking about the reception that you got there from people. Would you do that for us now, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll tell you very quickly about Patterson, New Jersey. So it's a city in New Jersey. It's not far from New York. In fact, from the hill that I visited in this chapter, you can actually see the towers of Manhattan. It was built as America's first industrial city, but after the Industrial Revolution, it's sort of fallen into decline. And certainly at the very heart of the city, which used to be its beating heart, you have all of these burnt out factories, mills. I went to this very large complex, which had been the Coke gun factory for a while, and it had also been silk factories for a while. And it was truly an urban jungle, in as much as it was grown over with plants, but it was full of homeless people and people who were choosing to hide out there for one reason or another. And this is what I mentioned before, the sort of different ways that abandoned places can make us feel. In an urban environment, entering an abandoned space is the nearest thing we have to stepping off the map. It offers anonymity, the succor of green space without the order, the omnipresence of man so implicit in a park or garden. An urban ruin might offer an effect upon the mind, akin to slipping into the dark forest or scaling a rugged peak. That same wild element, and we might seek it out for similar reasons. Amidst the crumbling mills and towering, blackened chimneys, the skeletal remains of industrial giants, I feel a flickering, a stirring of the soul. The shadow of the sublime passes overhead. Seen through this prism, the drugs baggies, the bloodied needles, the spray-painted trees, even the grimy encampments could be symbols not of a community in decline, but of an extreme anarchic liberty. What Anais Nin said, in chaos there is fertility. There is more than one kind of freedom, as Aunt Lydia tells her captive audience in Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. Freedom to and freedom from. In their new theocratic state of Gilead, the apprentice handmaidens are being given freedom from objectification, freedom from certain kinds of danger. In the days of anarchy, as Lydia calls them, meaning the before times, now it was freedom too. I have never seen the latter so clearly epitomized as in the unkempt wilderness grown up around the old Colt Mill. It is an instantly comprehensible demonstration, a defining of terms. There's no authority here to defy. To be here is to experience a raw kind of exhilaration laced with fear. There is a thrill in finding safe passage through a place with no safety rail, empowerment in the experience of self-determination in the extreme. But without the structure and strictures of normal society, the sense of possibility is so strong as to be dizzying. I could do anything, you think. I could be anyone, and no one will stop me. One realizes very quickly how thin the threads that hold our identities in place might be. Perhaps we only know who we truly are, in a place where no one tells us what to do.
Thanks, Cal. Did you have a newfound appreciation for home when you stepped back on the map?
I think so. Someone asked me the other day about how I felt about Slab City, which was the final place that I went to. And it's in California, and it's this sort of anarchic community. It's like a dropout place, you know. It's in the middle of the desert. It's on an abandoned military zone, and people have just thrown together a sort of slum shantytown type town, and it's wild, but it's also terribly frightening. And I think that when I came home, I'd felt like I'd hit my sort of limit of anarchism. I think, you know, this sense of it. The final night I spent there, I'd been woken by men shouting and screaming in the night, and I was just behind a thin layer of razor wire from some kind of ruckus going on, and I was inside a compound with a guy who was running the Slab City hostel, but it was just some guy who was looking after it for somebody else, and I was just in a hammock. And I think there's that sense of it being sort of extremely lawless, which had been thrilling during the day, then became a sort of oppressive sort of feeling. And I think that I was actually very grateful to come home. And yes, I don't know. I think it's interesting when you sort of push yourself like that. When I started going into abandoned places, I thought that the most frightening thing would be the physical danger that you put yourself in. You know, you risk asbestos, or you risk sort of cutting yourself in something rusty, or hypodermic needles and all of this kind of thing. But actually the thing that psychologically I struggled with most was just the sense of breaking rules. And I didn't realize how sort of like deeply threaded through me that was, you know, this sense of crossing a boundary, you know, literally transgressing, how much that would affect me. Because the second you cross a line where it says do not cross, you start to feel unsafe, you know, that you don't know what's going to happen. And often you really don't. But then also you feel like maybe there's no backup. And I think that was almost dizzying. You feel, I don't know, it's vertiginous sense of danger sometimes. And often when that fear is much out of proportion with the real sense of physical danger that you might be in.
Yeah, the more you cross, the further you go. And I have to say, I'd rather be with the wolves and the bears than some of the characters that you met in Slab City.
Right.
Yeah. So we have a question from Francis, who's asking, did you consider including St Kilda, or is that already too well known and already covered?
Yeah, I think that's one of the reasons I didn't do St Kilda, although it too is extremely important for wildlife. I think partly because much of the year it's actually not that empty. You know, there are sort of cruise ships land there, and there is a military presence, and there are sort of conservationists who are there for much of the time, and so I think it's an incredible story, and that's why people have written about it so much, and people find it very, very evocative, and so am I. I'm completely fascinated by the story of St Kilda, but I found that actually it didn't fit very well into the profile of the kind of places that I was looking for, which were mainly, aside from Detroit and Patterson, they were largely sort of emptied of people, and also were sort of relatively unstudied by conservationists. So I think I can't remember who owns St Kilda now, but maybe it's the National Trust or the RSPB or a body like that. And so I think I guess I was maybe looking for less well-known examples, but I think St Kilda is a great example.
Good to leave something for another day. Another question. This is from Amy in our audience. And she's asking, is there a risk that abandonment is sold back to us as a hope for biodiversity, whilst perhaps the human population is steadily ushered towards a more urban, industrialized experience?
I think aspects of that certainly are true. So abandonment, I think inarguably is a very useful thing for biodiversity, because well, one of the things that I write about in the first chapter is the sort of value of brownfield sites, and often they're much more valuable than they look. So many of the places that we would think are sort of messy or just in need of redevelopment, and they might not be valuable, are, when you look at them, very good for specific types of species. So invertebrates tend to do very well on what we call brownfield sites. So if you think about there's a case in Canvey Wick in Essex, which is a former oil terminal that's become the first bug reserve in the UK, as they call it. There's a fantastic charity called Bug Life, which has bought it and are running it as reserve, because it turned out that all of these sort of abandoned piers and broken bits of tarmac and concrete were just incredibly useful for this particular type of individual, and especially, invertebrates, but also reptiles. So things that do well in something called an open mosaic habitat. So when they need to have like lots of little types of habitats close together, so maybe like a small pool, but also next to somewhere that they can bask, but also next to shrubs and trees. So things that have a life cycle with many different stages tend to do well in a place like that. And so I think that, certainly people are paying attention to the value of those places now, and we're beginning to give them the sort of weight that they deserve, and protect some of them, because they're often a lot more biodiverse than, for example, a field that's been intensively managed. The aspect of you were asking about the human population being ushered towards a more urban experience, I think that's really interesting. I don't know that people are being ushered so much as generally people are choosing. And I think that this is sad in many ways, but in many traditional farming regions, people are leaving, especially in the developed world. And so urbanization is a huge trend. And if you want to keep people in rural areas, they, I suppose, need to have an economic future there, and they also need to feel that they want to be there. Certainly with the spread of the internet. I mean, I'm talking to you from the islands, where we have good internet and we have access. We've got a very thriving community here. Orkney has got a steady or even slightly rising population. So I don't think that is a foregone conclusion that we will all become urbanized, but from an environmental perspective, I also am not sure that it would be a bad thing for more people to be moving to the cities and leaving, especially the sort of less productive farmland, to go fallow.
I think it's safe to say anywhere that's marketed as a hotspot for bug life and reptiles will remain largely abandoned. Something. Let them have that one, I think.
A spider habitat, yeah.
I like spiders, but not snakes, and one or the other. there's a comment from Eleni in our audience who's saying it's really helpful to hear you read, Cal, and she's not a native speaker, so that's nice to hear. She's enjoying tonight. So I think it'd be remiss of me not to touch upon the last year, COVID and the pandemic, and where the timing of that fell with your work on the book and its publication. I'm sure you get asked this a lot, but to share with us this evening what the extent to which you had to do additions, edits, as news reports, some of them exaggerated, came in about wildlife reclaiming spaces, and that perhaps some sort of balance being a small silver lining to what's been a very difficult time. How did that affect this book, the timing?
Yeah, it was pretty strange timing, actually. I definitely hadn't anticipated this being a newsy book or a timely book in the way that it has been. But I had finished the first draft shortly before, about a month before the coronavirus crisis hit the UK. And so I was in the midst of my second draft when all of these reports of, dolphins coming back to Venice and so on hit the newspapers, and especially hit social media. And I think that my initial reaction was very skeptical. Knowing what I know, having written this book, the sense of wildlife returning in a matter of days just seemed incredible. And a lot of these claims sort of fell apart on closer inspection, or it turned out that these animals were sort of already living on, the margins of a city. So, for example, there was talks of pumas in Santiago in Chile, but they actually already kind of tend to drop in and out of the suburbs of the city, and a lot of these cases are that, like the goats in Wales, they are known to sometimes come into towns. But I think what these examples made me sort of think about, the more I thought about them, the more I realized that it sort of shows how this process works, right? Which is that constantly we've got sort of wild species at the gate, and every time that humans move back, we've got these scouts of all these different animals that are just like constantly testing the boundaries, seeing where they can build territory. And so we withdraw for a few days, and the first scouts start coming in, and over time things get sort of braver and start moving in more permanently. I think it made me sort of really realize how closely our world and theirs already overlaps. And this is how recolonization by different species works. So you have, I don't know, I learned about the idea of seed rain, which I talk about in the first chapter, which is how sort of plant species especially tend to colonize a new place. So, for example, this might be a volcanic island that's just popped up from the sea, but it could also be, an abandoned site covered in tarmac. From an ecological perspective, you're starting from a very similar place. And seed rain is this sort of idea that there are lots of seeds of different species sort of coming down all the time, whether that's because they've been picked up by the wind and they're sort of swifting about in the atmosphere on various areas.
Isn't it? Seed rain. Yeah. Yeah.
And then they sort of come showering down from the air, but it's also things like when birds drop seeds in their droppings and so on. So you get a spread of biodiversity that way, just through random elements. But then when it comes to animals, it tends to be things looking for new territory. Wolves would have found Chernobyl because when wolves get to a certain age in their sort of adolescence, they start striking off on their own as lone wolves, and they're looking for new land. And that's when you get them sort of wandering through cities or finding places like the exclusion zone in Chernobyl. So I don't know, it's like a constant movement, or a constant tussle between us and nature, sort of generally.
Change being the constant. I guess there would have been practical implications, though, had you not been able to travel, of course. In many ways, it's good that all that work had been done beforehand.
I'm so lucky, terribly lucky, actually, because I know quite a few people who've been writing books that involved a lot of trouble, who've just had to put their books either on sort of indefinite hold until they could get back out on research trips, or you know, things have come crashing to a halt. So I was extremely lucky with just the way that things fell.
Yeah, and absence is something we can all relate to from this year. Would you like to return to any of the islands?
Sure. You know, actually, the place I really enjoyed visiting and we'd love to go back to is Montserrat, which is the island in the Caribbean. Just for people who haven't read the book, it's they had a series of major volcanic eruptions in the late 90s, early noughties, and that caused their main town to be evacuated. It's such a charming place. It's very tropical. It's full of rainforest. Of course, it's really incredible to go down and see this. It is the Plymouth, which is the former capital. I mean, to visit it, it is like going to the set of a disaster. Maybe that's the best way that I can phrase it. You know, the scale of it's quite incredible, but the people are a delight, and it's very small. It's very safe. It's a really wonderful place. So I'd love to go back to Montserrat.
Okay, well, let's hope you get that wish. Might be West Lothian's a bit more accessible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Back in the mainland. Okay, and well, we're just sort of entering the final minutes of this conversation. So if you've got any more questions, comments, feedback you want to give to Cal, now is the time to give it. And I'll just keep an eye on all of that.
Speaking of West Lothian, I just want to kind of throw this in because, well, it's very accessible for a lot of people who might be on this call, and they've just opened something called the Shale Trail. So if you're interested in sort of visiting some of the sites that I write about in the book and generally finding out more about like the industrial history of that region, there's this great thing. It's an app, I think, and definitely a website, and some of it talks about biodiversity and some of it talks about the mining history of that region, and it's just open, so you should go. It's a lovely walk.
Got it. And that place, abandoned island, opens the book, doesn't, or near to the beginning of it anyway. I remember you're on a hike with your partner. By and large, am I right that you were in these places largely by yourself, and because it must change the dynamic and your impressions significantly about whether you choose to have company. I liked you talk about the difference between being alone and alone with. You know that sometimes it can be more scary than unpredictable company. But was that a deliberate choice that you wanted to feel your own edges alone?
I think so, yes. I mean, I did learn quite early on, partly because of the nature of the book, needing to write from a kind of lonely standpoint actually became more important than I realized at the beginning. And also, I think generally travel or nature books are often written by the sort of lone person who's moving from place to place and encountering things. And I think being a solitary person, that often it sort of removes a layer of skin, and it makes you experience things in a very different and more visceral way. So it has become, I don't know, it seems like a strange way to talk about it, but almost like a valuable tool in your arsenal to go to places alone. I think it's very important to sort of feel places very strongly if you're doing landscape writing, and almost try and have an epiphany in every place, because that gives you a way to write about it, a strong sense of where you are. So that became very important to me.
Good. But lots of so-called adventurers and explorers of the past didn't always feel rooted in home or a place, and it's clear that you do. And we've all been joining from our homes tonight. My less subtle link as I have to wrap up. It's been such a pleasure to dip into these places, swim ashore to the islands. And touch upon some of the big ecological themes of our time. So with that positive note to conclude on about near and far and feeling home and treading gently, it leaves me to give a huge thank you to all of you for joining us in this Wednesday Wigtown event. A big thank you to Cal for sharing her work and her thoughts with us. Do buy the book, buy it from the Wigtown online shop if you can. And a virtual round of applause, I think, is what's called for next. So I'll do that on all our behalfs, and say enjoy your reading, enjoy your exploring. Thank you and good night.
Thank you, Gemma.